All right, so I've got aggregate demand, aggregate supply, or I'm going to have it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about where I think we're at. Now, it's important to note that this is May 6th. By the time you watch this, we might have gotten new unemployment numbers, things might have changed, but I'm going to basically be drawing this for May 6th. So with this model, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, just a little note. When I went to grad school, I actually didn't know any macro models because I was taught by a heterodox economist, non-mainstream, and he didn't believe in equilibrium. So I go and I show up to grad school and I'm thinking I'm going to learn these models people are talking about, and basically my professor in grad school said, oh, I don't like those models. We prefer these things called new Keynesian models, which I actually ended up hating. I didn't learn these models until the financial crisis was happening. I was teaching my first macro class and I thought, all right, I better learn it. Now's the time. I love these models. And in fact, I've learned the high level models, and this model here, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, I think it does as good of a job as any of those models. So that's one reason why I'm drawing it this way. If you haven't learned this model, I don't think it's that big of a deal. You can totally understand what's happening without it. But if you know the model, hey, let's talk about it, right? So over here on the y-axis, we have aggregate price level. Sometimes my students like to put the CPI there, the Consumer Price Index. And then here we've got real GDP. So real GDP, aggregate price level. I'm going to first draw potential output. I label this Y0. Okay, so that is the best we can do in the long run given our labor markets and resources. It's associated with the natural rate of unemployment. This is the same concept as in the Phillips curve. In the long run, we're going to return to this no matter what inflation is. Okay, we've got aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, and again, I'm not going to go through why these are shaped the way they are, but this is what they look like. So basically, right now, I've got an economy that's at potential output, starting at potential output. You might imagine this is like a 2% rate of inflation. This is maybe 2% GDP growth, or you could put like our potential outputs at $23 trillion, something like that. Basically, if you put percents here, you can imagine, or if you put like levels here, like 23 trillion, you can imagine the whole thing like shifting. So the equilibrium actually is growing. You can totally ignore what I just said. Okay, so we're starting at potential output. COVID hits, we have a negative demand shock. We also actually had a negative supply shock with COVID because if you remember, there were like shutdowns. It was really hard to get supplies and stuff like that. It was a weird time. But what I'm going to draw is actually the inflation. Okay, so there's two things that cause the inflation. Aggregate demand too. The first is a positive demand shock, which I've just drawn on the Phillips curve, the movement along the left. This is because of the overshooting of the stimulus, but I also think it could just be like crazy demand for durable goods. So for example, demand for cars is just really high, refrigerators and stuff like that. Like you can't get a dishwasher. If you want a Bosch dishwasher, apparently you have to get on a waiting list. So it's like, okay, crazy high demand. So that's one of the things. But we also have a supply shock here. And again, there's two reasons for the supply shock. One is the war, right? The invasion of Ukraine. And the other is just like supply chain issues. That's another reason why you can't get a Bosch dishwasher. Is they're probably on a boat somewhere. It's just hard to get stuff right now. So basically, the cost of business has just increased. That's like what we would call an exogenous shock. And then we've got like an increase in aggregate demand. So it's like an endogenous change. And we end up right here. Now, I am not claiming this is necessarily the right answer. But basically, where I have us right now is in an inflationary gap with very high inflation. And there's two reasons why we have the high inflation. One is the demand pull, the other is the cost push. Demand pull, cost push. We see them both. So you could, like, if you really wanted to argue we're in a recessionary gap, I think you could overshoot this. You could um, have it go over into the recessionary territory. Um, but I'm just happen to draw it this way because our unemployment numbers, which just came out this morning, are 3.6%. I believe that's below the natural rate of unemployment. I think that we're still kind of moving along real fast. With that said, the real GDP numbers came out as a negative 1.4%. So you could say, well, maybe we're like starting to get into a recessionary gap. But those numbers were weird because of the increase in imports. And, consumer spending was still up, and gross private domestic investment was still up. So that's how I would draw our current inflation on this. Now, the next question is, what is the Federal Reserve doing about it? And basically, what the Federal Reserve is doing is it's raising rates. Just raised them this week, 0.5%, the federal funds rate. And that's contractionary policy intended to bring us back down to the original. It's worth noting, though, that we have had the supply shock. So even with the contractionary policy, we're at a higher inflation area. So that's aggregate demand, aggregate supply. You can feel free to ask questions on this. One of the beautiful things about teaching a class with no exams, though, is that you don't need to get stressed out about this model. This is just kind of, if you know the model, if you teach the model, how I would use it. Again, I think you can understand our current inflation without either of these models.